Hello everyone, Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 105th episode of the Writ Podcast. Next week there will be 3 by-elections taking place in Saskatchewan, which is holding its next general election in little more than a year. The contest will provide a glimpse of where things stand in the province, especially whether the Conservative coalition that is the governing Saskatchewan Party is splintering, and whether the NDP can make any gains in the kinds of ridings that they have to win if they ever have a hope of returning to power. To break down the state of politics in Saskatchewan, I'm joined today by Adam Hunter, the CBC's provincial affairs reporter in Regina. Adam, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Eric. How are you doing?
Good. We're a little more than a year to go before the general election next year, but how are parties approaching both that, the fact that they're entering into an electoral year, but also these by-elections that are taking place in the middle of the summer?
Yeah, there's been a lot of speculation over the last few months that maybe the Saskatchewan Party government would call it an early spring election. The next general election isn't slated until October of next year, but candidates have been nominated earlier than normal for both the NDP and the Saskatchewan Party, and so that's led to speculation there may be an early spring call. So that's made a bit of a different focus on these by-elections than there maybe would have been in a summer by-election. A summer by-election in Saskatchewan is extremely rare. We haven't had an August by-election since 1938. So this is something that governments typically tend to not do. People are away in Saskatchewan in the summertime on holidays at the cottage, and farmers are busy in the fields, ranchers are busy. So this is something that typically governments avoid. So the governing Sask Party and Premier Scott Moe had a choice to make. They could have called the by-elections a bit earlier. They waited until they were basically forced to call it because of legislation. So we have a vote starting on Thursday, August 3rd today, and then going ahead to August 10th. So it's a bit different as well. As there's this voting week. That's a new thing that's been introduced by the chief electoral officer for this by-election. So that's a bit different. But what the parties are looking at in this by-election, it's a bit of a split focus. We have one rural constituency of Lumsden-Morse, and then 2 Regina constituencies. They're actually next door to each other in Coronation Park and Regina Walsh Acres. So that has made it a little bit different for the parties as well, as there's different messages, different things at stake in those 2 areas.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go through some of them. I wanted to start with Lumsden-Morse. So this is a rural riding. It stretches from pretty much Regina all the way to Swift Current. Doesn't really have any big cities in it or anything like that. So it's a very rural riding, and the Sask Party won it with 73% of the vote last time. But it seems like it's going to be more of a test case, I think, for some of the other parties, particularly the Saskatchewan United Party. So tell me a little bit about how this by-election is being viewed.
Now, the Saskatchewan United Party is up and coming. This is their first test. They haven't ran in any sort of by-election or general. Brand new party on the right, trying to take a piece of the Saskatchewan Party's right flank. They have some money behind them. They have one sort of, you want to call it, defector from the Saskatchewan Party. Their leader is MLA for Saskatchewan Rivers, Nadine Wilson, who left the Saskatchewan Party. She was removed from caucus for misrepresenting her vaccination status a few months ago during the sort of the heights of the COVID pandemic, and so she'd become the leader of the Saskatchewan United Party. They're very busy on social media, online, on YouTube. I just did the drive actually not long ago from through Lumsden all the way to Swift Current. And there's a lot of signs for the Saskatchewan Party, Saskatchewan United Party candidate out there. Make of that what you will. They do have some money. They have a lot of organization for an up-and-coming party. But as you say, just a massive vote share of the Saskatchewan Party in the last few elections in this seat. Lyle Stewart is who stepped down in that seat. He was the former agriculture minister. He has been battling cancer for quite a few years and finally stepped down and resigned his seat. And so getting more than 70% of the vote in the last general is just a massive, hill to climb for the Saskatchewan United Party. You also have in this riding the Buffalo Party, which was the Wexit Party, which is kind of formed, a few years ago. They did fairly well in rural constituencies in Saskatchewan in 2020, but haven't ran they're only running one candidate in this by-election, as are the Saskatchewan United Party. They're only running in Lumsden-Morse. And when asked about the Saskatchewan United Party and this kind of threat, they're very critical of the government. Premier Moe, on the day of the by-election call, said that, if you're a serious party, serious about governing, and you've registered in Saskatchewan, you should run a candidate in all the by-elections. Well, the United Party, the Buffalo Party, and a couple other parties are only running one candidate in some of these by-election races. So make of that what you will. They're putting all their eggs in this Lumsden-Morse basket, but it's just a huge hill to climb. Blaine McLeod, who's running for the Saskatchewan Party, is well known in dairy farming areas of the province. He won the nomination, a contested nomination, which was tightly fought, and other names in there for the Saskatchewan Party and the candidates that ran in that race. So I think this is one that people have their eye on. I talked to a political scientist at the University of Regina, Tom McIntosh, who follows the Saskatchewan political scene quite closely. And he said he'd be very surprised if the Saskatchewan United Party or any other party was to take a huge chunk out of the Saskatchewan Party's vote. But he said, a 20%, share out, maybe giving the Saskatchewan Party 50%, still winning, but not as comfortably, that might send a little bit of a shock to the governing party. And that would be a message for them to take into next year, that the United Party is serious. On the other hand, if the United Party gets wiped out, I don't think much changes for them. They'll refocus, probably, as will the Buffalo Party and those parties, to try and focus on the race in the general election.
Do you get the impression that Scott Moe and the Sask Party are concerned about these other parties, or not? Are they taking them seriously as it is?
I think they are taking them seriously, in the fact that, after the last election, the Buffalo Party, as I mentioned, had a pretty strong showing in rural Saskatchewan in certain ridings where they ran second place and even edged out the NDP in those areas. And they were a brand new party, and that really, I think, surprised people. And in his victory speech, Scott Moe said, I hear you, I see you, about the people that didn't vote for him. He wasn't messaging the NDP voters, who got much more of the vote than the Buffalo Party, but he was sending a message to them. And there was criticism throughout the COVID pandemic that, perhaps some of the policies and decisions by the Saskatchewan Party were going towards, some people that were anti-health mandates. And that's sort of part of the place where the Saskatchewan United Party has grown, and where some of their supporters are from, and some of their outspoken supporters. They were big voices during that, and criticizing the government's decisions during the pandemic, and their health mandate decisions and the vaccine mandates and things like that. So we recently had one example in Lumsden, which is maybe the biggest center, one of the biggest centers in this riding, where a high school had a Planned Parenthood presentation, sex education presentation, and one of the materials that was brought into the classroom but wasn't for the presentation had some graphic images of it. It wasn't meant for a child audience or kids or teenagers. It was meant for adults, but it was part of the materials that this presenter had brought in, but wasn't meant to be distributed. One of the kids got a handle on this, and that has become kind of an issue that the Saskatchewan United Party has jumped on. They've held town halls in the Lumsden-Morse area, and they're really grabbing onto this, we want more say in education. We don't want certain things brought into the classroom, and they're trying to rally around this one issue, make it a bit of a wedge issue. The government did respond to that once this story kind of came out. The same day, the education minister said there was going to be a review of Planned Parenthood presentations in schools, which the opposition NDP has criticized as being, reactionary and catering to this one critical base of the Saskatchewan Party, maybe the right flank, or to try and stem some of the criticism coming from the Saskatchewan United Party. So that's one issue that's kind of been front and center in that area. That's apart from, the typical things that are being talked about right now, which in that riding is drought, which we're seeing in Saskatchewan. A lot of questions about, taxes. Carbon tax is also a big one there. So this has kind of been overshadowed by the Saskatchewan United Party, bringing that up as being an issue that they're really focused on. Whether it matters to their voters, it remains to be seen.
So that'll be one of the things to watch, I guess, to see whether there'll be any splintering of that vote, because as you said, it's such a strong riding for the Sask Party. It's hard to imagine that they would lose it, but if some of that vote starts drifting away, then in some other tighter ridings, there might be a concern about that. If we're thinking about tighter ridings, then we look at the two in Regina, where the NDP finished not too far behind the Sask Party. If we're starting with Regina Walsh Acres, this one is a little bit of an odd one because last time there was a former NDP candidate who ran as an independent, so that soaked up some of the vote. So it's hard to know exactly how close the riding actually would have been had it just been a normal kind of one-to-one race. But how's Regina Walsh Acres shaping up?
I know Regina Walsh Acres well, Eric, to let your viewers and listeners know a little bit of personal information. That's where I grew up. My parents still live in that riding, so I know very well. It was an NDP riding for quite a long time. And as you mentioned, Sandra Morin was that candidate who ran as an independent and kind of spoiled the NDP vote in the last election. She was previously a cabinet minister in the NDP government and won the nomination actually for the 2020 election. But then that was she was deemed not a candidate, successful candidate by the then leader Ryan Miley, who said through some of their checks they didn't, want her to run. She disputed all of that, saying that, anything that they, had found on a background was overblown and not an issue. We didn't get any details about that. But it's interesting because if you take Sandra Morin's vote, and I know this isn't, exact science, but if you take Sandra Morin's vote and give it to the NDP, they win that race in Walsh Acres. So she did play spoiler. There's none of that, expected spoiler in this race there. It's pretty straightforward. It's Jared Clark of the NDP, who last ran in Indian Head Milestone, which is a safe Sask Party riding. He's a teacher. He's a naturalist. He's a kind of a bird expert. People might know him in the Saskatchewan area. He frequently is a guest on different shows, including CBC programs, with giving his bird expertise. He's running against a really well-known name candidate in Saskatchewan, in Regina, Nevin Marquardt for the Sask Party, who's a bit of a star candidate in the fact that he's a former NHL player for the Boston Bruins. He played 9 years in the NHL. He was a Regina Pat in the WHL team, a star for them before he was drafted in the NHL. He's lived in Boston for a lot of his life. He recently came back to Saskatchewan over the last couple of years. So a lot of his family still lives here, and decided to run for the Saskatchewan Party. He's got a history in investment banking, cybersecurity, some of those things. So he's one of the candidates, I think, that the Sask Party and other parties actually had really, once they knew he moved back, really targeting him for a political run, and the Sask Party managed to nab him. So it's sort of a two-horse race there. It's really difficult to tell whether, the Derek Myers, who passed away sadly due to cancer, he was a young up-and-coming MLA in that riding for the Saskatchewan Party, former sports broadcaster, well-known person in Saskatchewan, whether his legacy and what he did for the constituency, whether that's going to have any impact on Nevin Marquardt and whether that'll help his candidacy, give it a bit of a boost. The by-election is, as you know, is so tough to call, but in a summer by-election, all the parties have told me, and one of the first things Nevin Marquardt told me when we were out door knocking, following him around, was that he's just telling people that there's a vote. So just getting the message out to people that, you need to vote in this by-election, making them aware of it. We went to one street where he talked to only one person was home in the evening. So as I mentioned, hard to get a hold of people in the summertime. And so that's going to be a big challenge. Walsh Acres is going to be one to watch. That's one that the NDP really, really wants. They have a strong Regina base, if you want to call that. And that's where the majority of their MLAs come from. Regina and Saskatoon, sort of half and half. They only have a dozen. So they really need to get these Regina seats, these historical Regina seats for them, going back maybe 15 years. They were solid NDP, and they have since swung to the Saskatchewan Party.
One of the little side stories, not that I don't think they'll have a big impact, but the PCs have a candidate here. They also have one in Regina, Coronation Park, and it's Rose Boschel, who's the interim leader of the party. This is a party that took only a couple percentage points last time, but in the polls, they tend to do pretty well. There's a lot of discussion whether that's a brand confusion with the federal Conservatives, but in the last poll that we saw from Insightrix, PCs, I think, were at 11 or 13% in Regina. What do you make of the fact that the PCs do tend to poll out well? Does anybody think that they have actually that much support?
As someone who covers this, we don't hear a lot of talk about the PCs. We don't hear a lot of talk about support for them. You don't see a lot of signs. Not to say that they don't have support from, as you mentioned, maybe people, associating them with the federal party, or, other things with there's some discussion about whether their legacy as a party being, the divine government from the 90s, early 90s and late 80s, mid 80s is something that sticks with them, whether they still have some supporters there. But it's really hard to tell. They've switched leaders around, as you mentioned. They have an interim leader. They don't typically come second in elections in Saskatchewan. They've kind of been supplanted by, as I mentioned, the Buffalo Party in the last provincial election, and the United Party now kind of getting more headlines, but also running more campaign style, tactics during the year, setting up more news releases, being more visible, doing more interviews, doing more media. So that's one change that you see from these other parties that are a bit more, in the moment and trying to grab onto the way that people are, following media. Whereas the PCs, they're not really on the radar here.
Yeah, we'll see if it is just a polling mirage or not. The by-elections will provide a tiny little glimpse, I guess. Okay, so we'll go to Regina Coronation Park. This is Mark Doherty's riding. It was only decided by about 5 points last time. That seems to be a really interesting one because of some comments that Mark Doherty made on another podcast, the Scoop podcast, which people should listen to if they want to listen to anything about Saskatchewan politics. But it seems to make this one a bit more of a wild card.
This one's interesting for me, probably the most interesting, because you have Mark Doherty, who, as you mentioned, was the former candidate. He's kind of the one who triggered this by-election. And he's been a kind of a thorn in the side of the Saskatchewan Party, as funny as that sounds, from, being going on a podcast recently, as you mentioned, and really sort of sticking it to the Saskatchewan Party in a way that was unprecedented in my estimation, from what we've seen in the past from former MLAs, from people that are involved with the party, for them to come out and be so critical. He, said people are struggling. He said the Saskatchewan Party slogan, growth that works for everyone, maybe isn't the reality of the situation. And when he was asked by a constituent for Coronation Park what he did for the riding in his almost 12 years since he was elected, he said he couldn't come up with an answer. And you don't hear that from MLAs, and you really don't hear that from MLAs when the governing party has remained. Maybe when they're on their way out, or there's a lot of fractures within the party. But the Saskatchewan Party has been really solid, and they've had a lot of very little drama as far as ex-candidates, ex-MLAs, current MLAs criticizing their policy. There's been a lot of party discipline there. So to hear Mark Doherty come out, the podcast was released the day after the by-election call, and that got a lot of headlines. And the NDP's been using it on the doorsteps. They've been using it in campaign material. They've been talking about it. The candidate for the NDP, Noor Burki, who lost to Doherty in the last election by just under 300 votes, he came out and he told me in an interview, "Oh, I love Mark Doherty. Mark Doherty's a great man." And you don't typically get that sort of collegiality from political opponents and people that have defeated you. But Mark Doherty is someone who's well respected in the city. He did a lot of nonprofit work before he was an MLA, and he was the speaker. So he had a bit of a down the middle approach in that job. And so I think that is what's going to be sort of interesting to see if that really gives the NDP the boost it needs. Coronation Park is a riding and has a heavy immigrant population, and you have two men who have moved to Saskatchewan from Pakistan that are running for the Saskatchewan Party and running for the New Democrats, and they're relative unknowns to people outside of that community. But in the community, you'll see lawn signs of both candidates on the same lawn, which you don't typically see a lot in elections. And I'd asked the candidates about that, and they said in their community, and they know a lot of the same people, that there are families that have divided loyalties because they know one person, they know the other person, or they support both men, and they're having a tough time, deciding where to put their lawn sign or what lawn sign to pick. So I thought that was a bit of an interesting wrinkle in this race.
Another one, and I don't want to spend much time on it, but this is one riding where the Saskatchewan Progress Party is running a candidate. So they are the New Liberals, who have rebranded because the federal brand was too problematic for them, I guess. it's not the first time we see this kind of rebranding happening, right? Because the Saskatchewan Party, in a way, is a rebrand from the PCs, although the PCs still exist, and there's a story about how the party was created. But we see this from the Liberals trying this. I'm not expecting them to do very well, but there's also been talk about the NDP having to do that, and whether the NDP needs a rebrand, and if the federal brand of the NDP is too much of a problem. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on, first of all, what the Liberals did, which, again, you can spend 10 seconds on it if you want. They only got 300 votes last time. But also just the question of the federal relationship and whether the Liberal brand, the NDP brand, whether it is a positive in Saskatchewan, in a province where the NDP used to dominate.
I think the Liberal and the Liberal rebrand, we'll start with that, is something that it'll be, I think we'll have to wait until the general election to see if that makes any difference. I don't expect them to get a big amount of the vote. I think that race in the race in Coronation Park is basically a 2-horse race. And the Progress Party, to get back to the PCs, after the Progress Party, the new Liberals were rebranded, the PCs came out and said, we're the real progressive party and we need Election Saskatchewan to change this name. So there's been a bit of a drama there, if you want to say, with the names. But we have in Saskatchewan, we have the Saskatchewan Party, we have the Saskatchewan United Party, which we've talked about. We have the Saskatchewan Progress Party, and we have the Progressive Conservative Party. So it can be confusing for voters. There isn't a big, outside of social media, I would say the Progress Party and the former Liberals don't have a big following. They haven't got support over the years. Their new leader, relatively new leader, Jeff Walters, is trying to change that. He's had a few different attempts to get his name and in the headlines, get the party in there. But he said, in the last election when he ran, he was trying to explain the government's, the Progress Party, the Liberal Party at that time's message. And he said on the doorstep, he couldn't get past people couldn't get past the name. So they had to change the name. When it comes to New Democrats, there's a lot of talk about the New Democrats maybe having to rebrand. They've been reticent to do that. They have a strong history in Saskatchewan. Obviously, they did rebrand from the CCF to the NDP at one time. But this is something that's a real sticking point for New Democrats. It's something when you bring up with them, they don't like to address that. But they do try and distance themselves from the federal party. And their leader, Carla Beck, has been really distancing herself from Jagmeet Singh and some of the policies and positions that he has. And so I think, if the NDP were to do very poorly in these by-elections, say they get swept, that's going to be a lot of pressure on Carla Beck, but it's also going to bring up this rebrand talk again. I think it'll really ratchet up if they do poorly in the next general.
Yeah. And just because I got this question from one of the listeners, if you're outside of Saskatchewan, you'd look at the province and see the history of Tommy Douglas and Roy Robineau and, see that it was a province that was very New Democrat for a long time. And really over the last 15 years, it's gone from a province where the NDP could compete and win to a province that is perhaps more conservative now than any other in terms of its results, so even more than Alberta. So what would be the Coles Notes explanation of why the NDP has been struggling so much in the last decade and a half?
Yeah, we'd have to do the Coles Notes version, Eric, because there's a lot of different theories on that. But I think one of them is that the Saskatchewan Party and Brad Wall really grabbed the province's attention, and they won the election in 2007 in a way that was they had a lot of support. They'd kind of been knocking on the door for a few years, and they needed that kind of dynamic leader and a new brand to kind of take Saskatchewan into the next sort of generation. And that was coupled with the time where the Saskatchewan economy was very prosperous and things were booming and people were moving back to the province that had left previously. And a lot's still made about that by Premier Scott Moe and the Saskatchewan Party almost on a daily basis in the legislature, even though it's been quite a number, 16 years since they were first elected. And now you have a whole generation of people, I'm 41, people my age who don't really remember the New Democrat government, or they didn't vote for them. Their parents maybe did, or, grandparents. So this is something that the NDP is having to battle. And the NDP and, let's say center-left parties do very poorly in rural Saskatchewan. As you know, Saskatchewan is voted, very blue Conservative Party of Canada basically pitching shutouts in federal elections here. And that support is translated over to the Saskatchewan Party. Scott Moe has kept the same popularity, when you look at some of the polls that come out, the premier polls, as Brad Wall had. And they're different people. They're very different leaders. But he's maintained that same sort of high 50s, low 60s% support. And so they just have a brand. They have, as I mentioned, a generation of voters who support them. They have a very strong rural base, as we talked about. And they've also taken over in the cities where the NDP was very strong. And the NDP, in the last election where they kind of got wiped out under Dwayne Ligenfelter, they had a lot of candidates who had been there a long time. And they didn't really kind of get into that rebuild, freshen, refresh mode when they needed to. And now they're trying to do that, but they have such a hill to climb. And we get into talks now about things like rebranding, and they've had several leaders now. I've talked about this, 4 or 5 leaders since they last were in government, and that's just too many to have any stability or garner any support. And you still have an uphill battle for Carla Beck and the NDP when they go to rural Saskatchewan, and they have to defend the previous NDP's record from, let's say, the mid 90s. And they're trying to shed that label, but it's tough. It's tough sledding.
Yeah, the NDP has had some drama during its time of leadership, and Ryan Miley resigned as leader last time, shortly after they lost the by-election in Athabasca, right? So these by-elections tend to have some broader consequences. So it'll be interesting to see how the NDP does, if they can actually pick up a seat or two in Regina, and whether these other parties are going to start making some drama for the Saskatchewan Party on the right. So, Adam, there'll be some interesting results, and I really appreciate you taking some time to come on the show and talk to us.
My pleasure, Eric. Thanks for the invite, as always.
Thanks again to Adam Hunter, and thanks to those of you who gave me some suggestions for questions in the chat. You can find a link to the Writ's chat in the show notes. I'm giving a shout out to some of you each episode, so thanks this week to Aaron, Tom McIntosh, and Gord. Last Thursday, after we had recorded last week's episode, the results for 2 Ontario by-elections came in. Former Liberal MP Karen McCrimmon won the seat of Kanata Carleton in what was a very close 3-way race, but it means that this part of the province won't be represented by a Conservative for the first time in a century. McCrimmon took 34%, with PC Sean Webster taking 32% and Melissa Conrad of the NDP taking 30%. In Scarborough-Guildwood, the Liberals' Andrea Hazel held on, though the party's vote fell by nearly 10 points. Hazel took 37% to 30% for Gary Crawford of the PCs, and 26% for Thaddeus Nevanethan of the NDP. On Tuesday, there will be a provincial by-election in the Nova Scotia riding of Preston. In 2021, Angela Simmons of the Liberals won the seat by nearly 15 points over the PCs. And finally, next Thursday, we'll have those 3 Saskatchewan by-elections. You can join me and Philippe J. Fournier for a live stream of the results on the Writ's YouTube channel. There's a link in the show notes. It'll start at 8 p.m. Central Time, 10 p.m. Eastern. All right, that'll be it for this week's episode. Until next time, thanks for listening.